Summative assessments and writing exams. When it comes to writing assessments, the vast majority of teachers think they know how to write assessments, write exams in particular, but very few people actually do know. And the fault of that actually is not on the teacher. The fault of that is on mostly administration when they say you have to write your own tests, but they don't teach you how to do it. And a lot of times, what we will do as teachers, we'll just write test items based out of question types that we've had in our books, or we will recycle old tests that colleagues had from years before, or some other thing. And the reality of that, of course, is that we're not really testing our students. We're just ticking a box the admin wants us to tick. And that's not fair to us as teachers or to our students, especially to our students. How do we know what they know? How do we know how to improve so that they can get better? We don't unless we really put some effort into our exam writing. Okay, so in this very short piece, this segment, we're going to talk about aligning assessments with learning goals and standards. I'm going to show you some do's and don'ts of crafting effective and diverse assessment formats. And then, of course, the last part is how do we provide constructive and actionable feedback. That's just a little tiny piece towards the end, but it's still important. Okay, so the main meat of this is going to be the first two parts, aligning assessment, but more particularly crafting effective and diverse assessments. Okay, so of course, summative assessments are, of course, formal evaluation of student learning that typically occurs at the end of a unit, course, or semester. You can also have summative assessments at the end of the week if you want to. That could be a little bit too much, but it's still possible, especially if you're finishing a unit every week. I don't think that any of us are, but I'm just saying it's possible, or every 2 weeks even. So, but it's just what you have, or the knowledge that they have accumulated over a period of time, and it's formal. Grades are recorded. Okay, so what are the benefits? Of course, we have multiple benefits. One, of course, is that it measures student learning outcomes. We have the learning outcomes. Well, we need to be able to measure our progress towards those outcomes, right? And so this helps us to do that. And then, of course, it can help to motivate and engage students by letting them know that, hey, look, at the end, we're going to have an exam, so you better be ready. It generally inspires students to, get more involved in the lessons, generally speaking, maybe not always, but for the most part. Okay, and then of course it helps us to inform our academic decisions. It helps us to adjust our teaching style, our how we're trying to get information across to students. Sometimes we might have to reteach something, but when it comes to these types of assessments, though, they're usually at the end, so there's not really any reteaching happening. But if it's like at the end of a unit, or if it's at the end of a quarter, or at the end of a semester, the next time period that we spend with them, we might be able to hit on a few of the important points that that the majority of the students may have missed, so that because that might affect what is coming next. So we can do that, of course. But for the most part, of course, it's too late to reteach. But as far as informing academic decisions, it could also help us to change the way that we're going to teach the next segment. Maybe they're not understanding because of the way that I'm doing things. Maybe I need to add more formative assessment opportunities into my lessons, that sort of thing. Okay. And then, of course, it helps us to identify areas for improvement for both the student and the teacher. Okay. So, uh, and then, of course, our alignment. We need to make sure that our exams are aligned with our outcomes. That goes without saying. Everything needs to be aligned with our outcomes. That's just the standard. So when we think about alignment, we want to start with the end in mind. Remember when I was talking about the rubrics the other day, I had mentioned that, when it comes to outcomes, yes, the outcomes are the things that we want to be at the end, but it's the beginning. It's where we're going to start from as well. Okay. And then, of course, we need to map our connections. So as you're making your exams, each item or each section you should have mapped to a particular outcome or to a particular piece of the curriculum that you taught during that segment, whether it's for the unit or the midterm or for the final exam. So one thing that I had had the teachers do in Saudi Arabia was that on each of their exams, especially for their final exams, their midterms and finals I'm talking about, I made them put the questions in the order in which they taught the material, the content. So let's say that it was the midterm. They had Unit 1 and then 5 questions that they asked for Unit 1. Unit 2, and then they would have 5 to 10 questions. I'm just saying 5 because it's a nice number. But they would have to have their questions per the units. And this way I knew that they were aligned. And I could go back, and, when the results came in, I could go back, me as an administrator and them as a teacher, and also the students could go back and say, well, apparently I didn't really understand what was happening in Unit 1. And so we could pinpoint the area of weakness. So it's very important that we map where the questions are coming from. We don't just write random questions and then it's from all over the place. It's just I have a question from Unit 1, a question from Unit 3, a question from Unit 7, and then from Unit 1 again, and then it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't help us to help the students by writing exams like that. When it comes to these midterms and these final exams, we want to make that particular thing easy for our students, because we're not testing their personality or their ability to deal with stress. We're testing their ability to answer questions properly, right? So by putting them in this order, if students can remember things like that, then bonus. That's a good thing. When they get out into real life and they remember things based on the order in which they have encountered them, that's not a bad thing. That's a very good thing. So keep things in order for everyone's benefit, right? Okay, so map them. And then, of course, make sure we choose the right level of complexity for our, we're talking about our outcomes matching our questions. Make sure that we don't make the questions too complex. Again, we want to, and I think this is better covered in another part of, what I'm going to talk about next when it comes to language use. And then when it comes to our question types as well, remember that we want to ask a variety of question types, not just all true or false, for example. And in fact, when it comes to question types like true or false, you have to ask the proper question type for the kind of content. An example is if you have I don't know if any of you have any listening parts in your exams, but maybe in English you might have a listening section. If you do, true or false is not appropriate for listening, for example. It doesn't test listening comprehension. And in fact, it's a 50-50 chance of getting it correct. So, just true or false questions typically are good for reading comprehension if you wanted to, um, that sort of thing. But, true or false, I'm not a fan of true or false anyways, but it is a question type that you can use. Make sure that our exams are fair and are inclusive. In other words, don't make them biased. Don't make them so that, I mean, that a particular kid can't answer a certain question type. Don't add those question types. You've already given that particular student a disadvantage. You know, um, again, it's not about trying to see if we can test their stress level. It's seeing if we can test their knowledge level. Okay, so consider diverse learning styles and backgrounds. Sometimes, the questions that you have, you might want to include pictures for them to help evaluate. Even if it's a reading comprehension, having that little picture associated with it can help. Um, just because that's the way some kids are wired. And then when we offer accommodation and modifications, this just means that, like, if you know that a student is having a real difficult time reading, but they can get the information by you reading it to them, well, it's okay to, because it depends though. If it's a reading question, then there's nothing you can do about it. But if it's a different kind of question, where they have to get some kind of information, but they have to read in order to get some information, then it's okay to read it to them and then test their information gathering skills. This is what this means. Also, like what we did in Saudi Arabia was, we had, we don't have it here, but I'm just using this as an example. We had Islamic studies. And in Islamic studies, we had students actually who couldn't speak Arabic. Believe it or not, in Saudi Arabia, we had students who couldn't speak Arabic. But it was Islamic studies. But the exams were in Arabic. So we actually, it was a kind of a fight at first with my counterpart, the principal, because I was the director of the school. And so I told him, I said, look, it's not an Arabic test. It's an Islamic test. So I want them to go into another room and have somebody translate the questions to them. And so they took them into it, and then the kids didn't do so bad. They were able to answer the questions because they had trouble with the Arabic, not with the Islamic. It was an Islamic test. So that's one of the things that, if you come across it, it's fair to be able to offer accommodations and modifications if necessary. Ask yourself, what are you teaching? What are you assessing? If you're not assessing a particular thing, well, remove that thing from the test and, give them ask them the questions in a way that is accommodating. Okay. Use bias-free language, of course, and content. We want to make sure that, we accommodate for, the diversity that is within the school. And then, of course, review and adapt our assessments. One thing that I am an advocate of is sharing our tests with our colleagues and having them go through them as well, without the answer key. Because a lot of times if we see the answer key, we are predisposed to answering according to the answer key rather than answering according to our thoughts. When you share your tests with your colleagues, not with your supervisors, that's different. When you share a test with your supervisor for them to review for you, that's a separate thing. But if you share your test with your colleagues, share it with them, get them to answer the questions based on their thought patterns, and see if something comes up that maybe there is a different perspective. Maybe the answer could be something different based on how they see the question, right? So, and then if you when I'm talking about reviewing and adapting assessments regularly, is if you recycle questions, uh, because you should be building a question bank according to your different units and things to make it easier and easier as your career progresses. But you have to revise them. You have to go back and check those tests every time you give them to make sure that the test pertains to your students. Okay, so and then we want to master our exam construction. So here are some strategies to craft effective, fair, and anxiety-reducing exams for your students. Remember, anxiety is a deterrent to good test taking. So planning and structuring an exam. First thing we want to do is define our goals. What do we want to get out of this exam? What are our goals with this particular exam? Of course, those should be, aligned to your outcomes. So by defining your goals, by having outcomes, it should be pretty easy to define your goals. Okay, just make sure that you're aligning your questions with your outcomes. And then, of course, map your objectives, the same thing that I already said in the previous section, previous part a couple minutes ago. Make sure that your question types match what units they're coming from, which objectives that you covered in the class. Remember, never test anything that you didn't teach. If you gave something for homework, but you never really talked about it in class, you cannot test it. You can assess it by asking questions in class. You can assess it by making students give presentations on particular things. You can assess it in different ways, but you cannot test it. You can't use it on an exam if you didn't explicitly talk about it in the classroom. Okay, so please keep that in mind. And then, of course, you want to organize your content. The same thing that I've already mentioned. Put the stuff in an order that is easy for you to be able to use that data after they finish the test. And then, of course, you want to use clear instructions. The questions aren't the test. The answers are the test. We want to know if they can get the correct answers, not if they can interpret the question. So when you write your questions, either make sure that they are questions that have already been asked, question type, that is. So they're used to the structure of the question. They're used to the language of the question. The question itself is simple so that when it comes to answering the question, the answer is the test, not the question. Okay, I hope I'm being clear about that. That leads us to our test items themselves. With our test items, we want to focus on the specific learning objective or learning outcome. When we say objective, remember our objectives build to our outcomes. So you have different objectives, learning objectives in each class and each week, etc. So make sure that your questions, your test item itself is focused on something that you taught, one of the objectives that you taught. And then use clear and concise language, as I've said. Make sure that, especially when it comes to like that content that you want students to get information from, especially if it's like a reading comprehension or if it's a science question where they have to read about a particular experiment, or if it's some kind of historical event from social studies or whatever the case may be, make sure that the information that you're using is correct information. It's accurate information, and make sure that it's relevant to the questions that you're asking. Don't just put a bunch of stuff there and then just, ask them to, pull some kind of answer out. Okay. Make sure that everything is relevant. accurate and relevant. And then, of course, we want to avoid leading questions and clues. Quite often, and from my experience, I've actually seen where there will be a question and there will be answers, right? And then the next question, the answer was actually given in the previous question. So, you want to make sure that you're careful about that. And then we want to try to pre-test our items. One of the standards of test writing is always to try to have a focus group do the test before you issue it to everybody else. That's one of the standards in universities and schools around the world. What I recommend here is just sharing your tests with your colleagues first before you give them to your students. And it's not the best thing, it's not the ideal thing, but it's something at least. Okay, and a lot of times we can, when our thought processes, we can see things from different perspectives, and sometimes we will come up with answers, especially those short answers or fill in the blanks or whatever, sentence completion and things. Sometimes we come up with different answers than the answers that are expected. So then we have to either include them as possible answers or rewrite the question. So at least have your colleagues look at your tests. Okay. Then, of course, we want to balance our different question types. There are all kinds of question types. Everybody is aware of the multiple choice. We'll talk a little bit more about multiple choice questions in a second. But we have multiple choice. We have true false. I'm not a fan of true false. True false should only be used in very specific things. Maybe when it comes to social studies would be a good one if they have to memorize dates and events. And they're expecting that type of thing. And then, of course, we have matching. Matching is really good also for social studies, especially geography, when students have to match different names for different regions or different rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. But you can also have matching for matching definitions, words with definitions if you want to. And then, of course, there is short answer. Remember, short answers are, no more than 5 words. And usually with short answer, we're not requiring students to write full sentences. So remember that if you're asking short answer questions, try not to make it. Don't give them 2 instructions. Don't say this is a short answer question and write incomplete sentences. That's 2 different things that you're tasking them on. So please don't do that. Task on one thing at a time. So if it's a short answer, just let them write the short answer. Don't require complete sentences. Okay. And then, of course, the open-ended questions. Open-ended questions, now this is where you require complete sentences. So you ask, describe something in 1 or 2 sentences. Describe this as an example. Okay, so that's when you would require complete sentences. And then, of course, we have essay types, or it could even be paragraph, write a paragraph about something. And then we have problem solving. Problem solving doesn't only have to be for math. Problem solving can be for science, and it could be for social studies. It can even be used for English as well. But I'm saying social studies in particular because you can ask, you can ask them to review a particular paragraph, and then what would you do? It could be an opinion type thing. What would you do in order to solve this problem? So, and then but the grading on that is kind of subjective. You'd have to be very, very clear on what you're expecting from the students in that case, because they could come up with any number of answers, to solve particular problems. So I would be careful with problem solving on exams. Okay. And then a special note about multiple choice questions. What we want to focus on is 3 3 options is optimal for KG through 12. And even in college, a lot of times, if it's a subject exam, not a language proficiency exam, because remember, those are different types of things. So the reason why is because it reduces guessing, it increases discrimination, and I'm not talking about racial discrimination, I'm talking about choice discrimination, and it helps with cognitive efficiency, it helps our thinking ability, and it reduces ambiguity. So increased discrimination, by giving a smaller pool of options, it forces students to differentiate between subtle distinctions in the choices. And when we talk about the subtle distinctions between the choices, this is where the subtle difference comes in. Is, first of all, we want to have an obvious correct answer, and then we want to have a close answer. And then, of course, one obviously wrong. Now, when we talk about reducing our guessing, well, at this point, your choice, when you, as a student, can recognize immediately that this answer is wrong, and I know this one's wrong, well, now I'm down to 2 choices. And yes, it's a 50-50 chance, but I'm not really guessing. At this point, I really have to look at these 2 choices and try to decide which one is the actual answer. So when I'm talking about reducing, increasing my discrimination, it's I have to discriminate between these 2 and figure out why this one is better than the other one. Why is this one correct and this one is not correct? Okay, so if we have 4 choices, well, then, it's been proven scientifically, actually, that students just, when they see 4 choices, they guess a lot. They just guess. It definitely helps to have one obvious, one close, and one obviously wrong. Okay, so when you write your tests, I recommend using the 3 choices. We really get better results on what they actually know and what they don't know. Then our midterms and our finals and our end of unit exams really become meaningful because we know that they're actually spending time. And you'll see a difference. Try it, even with the end of unit test. Just try it out and observe the way the students are doing it. You'll see a difference. Setting appropriate exam length and difficulty levels. Of course, this is important. Let's focus on our exam length not being very long. I know that you have your standard, time that's dictated to you by your admin. So, when you're writing your exam, just consider, the student level and learning experience itself, and then having the variety of question types in those long exams is extremely important. If they're doing, an hour of just reading comprehension, that's just, that's horrendous. So make sure that, you have a variety of question types. And, even when it comes to writing, depending on the grade level, of course, your writing could be, 45 minutes to an hour by itself. And students will take the full 45 minutes in an hour writing an essay. No doubt about that. And then you want to pre-test your sections. And what I mean by this is, your question types. Make sure your students understand the question types that they're going to be hit with. Even going over the questions before, not the types of questions that, that they're going to be able to look up information on before the test, but if you have like a standard question type, like choose the best answer from the choices in the table, going over a question type like that so that they understand what it means. That's what I mean by that. But obviously you don't want to go over actual questions that they can look up before the test. And then, of course, we want to offer clear time guidelines. letting students know that they will be notified halfway through that the exam is halfway done, and then they're going to be notified 10 minutes before the end, that sort of thing. This usually comes out in your exam protocols. They're a written document stating, when the exam should start, how long students can, how far into the exam students can actually enter, when they can leave. And it also goes into how grading happens, like if you're going to do double marking and then triple checked or something like that. Usually it covers all that stuff. Provide breaks and pacing strategies for exams. What this means, don't provide a break during an exam unless it's one of those 3-hour exams or whatever. But then in those exam protocols that you would have something like must be escorted to the bathroom, or something like this. And then when I'm talking about pacing strategies, it's, teach your students how much time they should be spending on each section of an exam so that they can get used to it. Because a lot of times, like if you have that writing section at the end, sometimes students will forget about that and they'll spend all the time on the reading and on the short answers and all that stuff, and then forget about the writing part. So make sure that you cover all of that stuff with your students, just so everything is clear and there's no surprises. When we talk about bias and test anxiety, we want to make sure that we review our question language again by going over the question types with students beforehand, so nothing is a surprise. We want to offer diverse representations. All that means is if while you're writing a test and you're going over your question types with the students, if you find that a student just is having difficulty answering particular question types, let's say that they're really bad at matching, but they're better at answering questions through multiple choice or through short answer or fill in the blank or something like that. Well, then consider not using matching in your test, because remember, the question is not the test. Getting the right answers is the test. Okay. If they can get the right answers by doing a different question type, then that's what you want. And then, of course, we need to acknowledge test anxiety. I know in some places, some admin has difficulty acknowledging that students get anxious when it comes to taking tests. Some people like when students have stress. Try to push back against that sort of thing if you can. Acknowledge that students do have test anxiety. It's a normal thing. Not all students, but some, and that anxiety releases a chemical in the brain that prevents them from answering questions. Okay, so try to reduce anxiety, try to reduce stress so that they can focus on answering questions, getting the correct answers. And then, of course, practice makes perfect. One thing that I like to recommend is having a practice exam before the exam, using the same question types, not the same questions, but having the same question types in the same order that you're going to present them on the actual exam. There's nothing wrong with doing that. You could have it as an activity, an exercise in class if you want to. It does become a little, it could be time consuming and difficult to try to do that. But if you come up with one, you can always recycle it year after year, as long as you're using the same content. Just get your exercise and activity things ready, year ahead of time, so the first time you do it, it's going to be time consuming, but after you have it, then you're good to go. So consider having practice tests ready. Okay. And of course, now we want to do just real quick grading and providing feedback. Grading and feedback are pivotal steps in the learning journey, as we know. Grading can also create a lot of anxiety, but what we want to do is consider effective grading strategies for different types of assessments. When it comes to multiple choice, true, false, and matching, for these types of questions, we want to have an answer key. And with the answer key, we want our colleagues to review it for us. After they go through the test for us and come up with their own answers, of course, we then want them to also review our answer key to make sure that we haven't made any mistakes. If we've made any mistakes in our answer key, before you grade the students' exams is the best time, to find out and fix it. And when it comes to short answer and problem solving, having an answer key is good, but also make sure that your colleagues review it, because maybe sometimes with short answer and problem solving, different answers might come up depending on the perspective of whoever is looking at the question. So make sure that, yes, you have your answer key, but have either you change the question if you see where there's a different answer that could fit in there other than what you intended, or you either change the question or you allow for that optional answer. Okay, always remember that if optional answers fit, don't mark your students wrong if they come up with an answer that actually fits, but just because you didn't have it in mind. Okay, and then with open-ended questions and essays, it's best to have rubrics. You want to have rubrics for these types of things. Open-ended questions, the rubric is probably going to be quite small, but essays are probably going to be, maybe 4 or 5, even up to 6 criteria. Try not to make it 6, that's too much. And then if you're going to have rubrics for these types of questions, make sure that you go over the rubrics beforehand so that they know what to expect. Providing constructive and informative feedback, we want to focus on the learning, not just the marks. Be specific and actionable. Again, have an action plan for, well, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to study a little bit more, or, whatever they need to do in order to, get better. And then emphasize strengths and positive aspects. Always talk about the good things that they did. You don't want to have, it's with anything. You want to talk about some positive stuff also. Don't always make it negative. And then also, obviously, we want to use respectful and encouraging language, and then offer different modes of feedback. When it comes to different modes of feedback, you have the grading system that obviously we use, but consider written feedback, verbal feedback. You can have individual feedback. You can have group feedback. So there are different types of feedback that you can do depending on the student. Some students just aren't very good at receiving feedback in a group setting. So you might want to just talk to that kid on the side, and not in front of other students, sometimes. So using assessment results to inform future instruction. We've given the exam, and now we've gathered our data. What are we going to do with it? Well, we need to be able to identify individual needs. We can do that quite easily with the results of the exams. We can identify class-wide trends, what we also call global issues in the classroom. We can also use this data to refine our assessments and feedback practices. And we can also use it to share results and celebrate progress. So you see that the kids have made some headway, and you can celebrate that, even if it's just small achievements. Not everybody got 100, but everybody got over 80. But before that, they were in the 70s. So celebrate those small things. Remember, the kids love parties, so celebrate the small stuff. Okay. So in summary, we want to make sure that we align our assessments, of course, make sure they're aligned to our outcomes, our objectives and our outcomes. We want to make sure that we balance them, make them clear. We want to make sure that they're fair and inclusive. We want to make sure that we provide effective feedback, and remember that we are in the game to continually improve. It's never the end for teachers. We are lifelong learners so that we can be lifelong teachers. Okay. Any questions?